Welcome to Well Good Movies, the podcast that gives you the movies well worth watching, even if there are some duds along the way. Combining questions, trivia, and games, every episode we're challenged to watch a piece of film history to decide whether it deserves to be remembered for all time in our movie vault. With every film chosen in our previous episode, it's the perfect way to watch and discuss along at home. But don't just take my word for it. Here's a snippet of what to expect in today's episode. But today we're just going to have a fun one, which is going to be me versus Craig, which is always entertaining. And for anyone who's keeping track at home, I've never won against Craig, so it's all on today. But,
not all on today. You make it sound like you win this, and all other competitions we've done are null and void.
We end the podcast if I don't win. No.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Are you not entertained?
I'll be back.
Here's Johnny.
You're a wizard, Harry.
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
I'm Batman.
And beyond.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Well, good movies.
Hello and welcome to Well Good Movies, the podcast that gives you the movies well worth watching, even if there are some duds along the way. I'm your host, David Oscar, and I'm joined by my co-host, who is undeniably back from traveling the multiverse on a murderous rampage, Craig MacDonald. Hello, Craig. Which multiverse version are you? Hello?
Sorry, I phased out there for a second. Yeah, hello. How's it going?
It's going good. What were you after then? Wanda was after her kids. Were you after?
I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, don't get me wrong. It felt like I disappeared for a little bit, but then nothing's been going on.
Okay, just seems like something Craig would have done. So many multiverse films out there at the moment. I'm sure we've seen like a version of Craig out there.
I feel like this is the multiverse where I probably tolerate you the most, to be honest.
That's what I was thinking. Are you looking for a multiverse in which I don't exist? So, as we alluded to there, Craig, we talk about movies well worth watching despite duds along the way. So, as today is our update episode, today I want to know, what films have you seen recently that might be duds or well worth watching?
So, I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that we've watched Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which I think is safe to say that we both thoroughly enjoyed. It was actually quite nice to have something from Marvel which wasn't trying to go for a lot of the sort of, you know, cheesy, campy laughs in the ways a lot of them do, but just actually embrace a lot of the sort of horror-esque elements that were teased to us. And even though apparently it could have been more, I'm actually quite satisfied with what we got. I wasn't one of those stupid people who went into the film thinking, oh, they're going to give us 50 million different things from all these other places. So what they actually gave us, I was quite happy with.
Yeah, that one is definitely for me kind of, I came out of it like that was more the madness rather than the multiverse aspect. I think it was mad, but it wasn't the multiverse film that people wanted. But I'm more on the side of like, if you're going to give me cameos, I'm more on the side of breaking their necks and blowing their heads up rather than like, you know, them playing some sort of cheesy role in it. So I quite enjoyed it. You know, not a perfect Marvel film, but, you know, has its problems, but definitely was a fun time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And any duds, or have you mainly enjoyed yourself at the cinema recently?
I think it's been fine. I mean, I probably would have spoken about the main duds on a previous episode. One film that I did watch that I do need to sort of call attention to is the Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, featuring Nick Cage as Nick Cage. This is a hard film to describe. All I will say is you need to go into this film with the exact right mindset, insofar as you're going to watch a parody of Nick Cage insofar as how he himself views his career. So long as you go in with that mindset and understand that you are obviously going in realistically as some form of Nick Cage fan, you are obviously going to enjoy yourself. If you don't like Nick Cage, you're obviously not going to like this film, because this film basically does metaphorically suck up to him in a massive, massive way. As a Nick Cage fan, I loved it. I thought it was a great film. Some definitely odd choices. There's basically a sense of he has like a sort of devil over his shoulder, which is one of his previous film roles, and is him awkwardly either in makeup or in or de-aged digitally. But yeah, I thought it was humorous. I quite enjoyed it, and they put him through a number of different weird scenarios. The film genre seems to flip quite a lot in this film. Yeah, I recommend it if you're a Nick Cage fan. If you're not, don't talk to me.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of crazy, kooky films out there like that at the moment. Not had a chance to watch Everything Everywhere All at Once yet, but you know, that's another one in which it just seems to be like, yeah, why not? Just do all this kind of crazy stuff. I think one of the scenes I did see from that film was the one with him and Pedro Pascal watching Paddington 2.
Yeah, that is a thing that happens. They talk about what their favorite films of all time is. And Pedro Pascal's character says that his favorite film of all time is Paddington 2.
So yeah, and understandable. Again, another one which is a big favorite of people's, where people are like, don't diss that film and stuff like that. So
it was either number 1 or number 3. I can't remember which way round he said. And then either his third or his first favorite film is Face Off.
Yeah. Well, more of the Nick Cage love then. Yeah, for me, I think. Obviously, yeah, Multiverse of Madness was like quite a big one before it came out in terms of like having like Wanda and, you know, Doctor Strange, 2 characters I quite enjoy. So that one I did have fun with. I would like to see it again before it goes to Disney Plus. The one which I was also not really bothered about before it came out, but I checked out only last night then, just because so many people talking about it on Twitter, etc., was Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers.
Oh God, that.
But I think you haven't seen it, have you?
No, I've not seen it.
I think you would quite enjoy it because
really,
yeah, it definitely overcomes the issues, which I think Paul agrees with me in terms of Space Jam 2. You know, in terms of what we hated about that film, this film does well, and just some of the jokes and references they throw in there, I'm like, how is that in this film? How did that make that in here? I don't know if you've seen about a certain ugly character. No. Okay, stay off the internet. Go watch Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers in the next 2 days.
Okay, where can I see it?
Disney Plus. It's like a premiere film on there, so it's gone straight to the service. And I love this joke, this character who turns up in here, because I was one who was quite like, when people were like, yeah, you know, like, we don't like this, we won, etc. I'm not saying I was in favor of that version of the character, but I was just like, oh, I'm not sure what this says about, you know, demanding things from creators, etc. But if the outcome of that was to have this joke, I'm like, okay, I'm perfectly happy with this now, apart from the fact that, you know, there's a lot better version of that character out there. Apart from that, like I said, I think that it's a very fun film. It's very like Roger Rabbit-esque in that it's quite a modern version of it. There's the mystery element. There's the whole, you know, animated characters in the live action world. I think that they do that quite well in, you know, the sense of like live action, and just how they approach like weird trends in animation, etc. Like you would have possibly seen in the trailer that they're like, oh, where are we? We're like downtown, where all the weird reject CGI characters go, and they're kind of throwing reference to like Beowulf and Cats and stuff like that, with these weird Uncanny Valley-esque human characters, one played by Seth Rogen. As for this episode today, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of like an update episode. So we're going through a Movie Vault update as we're getting to sort of almost the halfway point of the year. We're going to be recapping our usual task of deciding whether films go into the Movie Vault, our vault of movies that celebrates chosen films for all time. So as we're coming up to that period in the year, we thought we'd give everyone an update on the films. We previously had like our Movie Vault update at the start of the new year, which sort of updated people about everything in the Movie Vault. So we thought we would just go through this run of films that we've done for the sort of like last 5-6 months and see how the list overall is looking. So that means looking all the way back to something like The Room in January, and then, you know, forward to quite recently where we talked about Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde just 2 weeks ago. But we're not alone in updating you and recapping those films. Don't worry, it's not just me and Craig sort of recapping our thoughts on those. We are joined by our previous guest, writer and editor, Paul Klien. Hello, Paul.
Hello, thank you for having me back. Thank you so much.
No problem. Yeah, we had to get you back. It was a fun time talking about Snatch last time. Craig.
Yeah, don't mention the euphemism.
Yeah, that was a fun one. Obviously, an episode as well, which you went with Craig's choice as well of Italian Job. So that led us down a fun route where we got to talk about that film.
And thank you for being the only guest who has chosen one of our films throughout this entire run.
But we're not showing favoritism. That's not why you're on today, Paul. You're obviously we know
It's
that
100% why I'm on.
No.
I know how to play host. I know how to get good bits.
No, we know you're definitely one of those who are like a great movie buff. So it's probably a lot of the things we've watched over the last few weeks. I'm like, well, Paul's probably seen this before, but if you've been watching along with us as well, I'm sure you've had just as fun a time. But we talked there about what we've recently been watching in terms of duds and movies well worth watching. So, Paul, what are some of the stuff you've enjoyed recently? Or not enjoyed equally.
All the stuff you've mentioned, obviously Doctor Strange, which I think is top tier Marvel. It's got Sam Raimi's personality in it. Everyone, no fight scene ends without someone smashing their head against something. It was just full of his sort of whimsy, which I enjoyed, and I enjoyed the cameos. I felt Spider-Man Far From Home had maybe one too many, and it felt a bit like Sandman's not got much to do here, and nor does Lizard, and so it felt like maybe 3 villains was the limit that you could have done. And this one, I thought the cameos were done quite well. Unbearable Way, I thought was brilliant. Rescue Rangers, I really love. I think a lot of people are saying it's like Roger Rabbit. I think it's more like the 2011 Muppets with Amy Adams and Jason Segel. It's like that meets 21 Jump Street, I think, for sort of rebooting a franchise and sort of poking fun at reboots in general. I thought was really clever. And
that's a great comparison, actually. Yeah, I got a Muppets vibe from it, but yeah, 21 Jump Street, another good shout.
Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think, is one of the films of the year, if not the film of the year. So I've been quite lucky. I did see Firestarter. I saw the remake of Firestarter, and that was dreadful. And everyone said it was dreadful, and I was like, I'm a guy who likes terrible films. I'll fly the flag for bad movies. I reckon I'll enjoy this. And even I was like, this is... How is Zac Efron as a sexy dad been made into a boring film?
Yeah, it's quite a weird career choice. I think was it after this he's like, I'm ready to go back to High School Musical. This is like that shows how bad his career is going. He's just like, yeah, I need to go back to Disney.
Yeah, or just he's really funny in comedies. He is really funny. Like the Neighbours movies are funny.
Yeah.
Mike and Dave Need Wedding Days, I think, is really funny. I think do more of that.
Though Dirty Grandpa was not a great turn.
That was terrible. That was dreadful.
Paul, how are you feeling about today's list of all the films that we've been discussing over the past few months? Are there any favourites, any ones that you've got sort of controversial opinions about?
The most controversial, my opinion, get with this list is, in terms of like The Dark Knight, I think Batman Begins is better.
Oh. Because
I think it's sillier, and that's why I enjoy it more.
Yeah.
Because it feels more like a comic book film, and I think The Dark Knight is good. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love The Dark Knight. I saw that film so many times in the cinema. That came out, I was 2008, I was 14, so I was like obsessed. I was like, Christopher Nolan is the greatest director of all time. But I prefer Batman Begins, and Snatch, I enjoy most of these films. I low-key really enjoy The Room.
To be fair, I mean, we both also enjoyed the vast majority of this list, because I think what we'll establish later is how many of them made it into the movie vault as opposed to not made it in.
Yeah, exactly. And, a lot of like big famous ones have come up because it's like, oh, well, we need to talk about this. If we're talking about anime or if we're talking about Guy Ritchie films, we need to talk about this one. So, there's a lot of like big films that have come up via this, but it's been, really pleasant to kind of like revisit or see some like classics that we've never seen or some more modern ones in the case of some of the animation stuff. So, yeah, it's going to be a fun discussion, recapping all the films that we've been discussing. So, we're going to sort of talk about how how we feel about the run of films so far, any highlights, discussing what went into the movie vault, and, maybe some stuff that we didn't get to talk about before. And then at the end, we'll still have our traditional Endgame. Obviously, it won't be choosing next time's film because that has already been chosen in the form of Frenzy, the Alfred Hitchcock film, which we'll be discussing on our next episode, which was chosen by Mary in our last episode. But today, we're just going to have a fun one, which is going to be me versus Craig, which is always entertaining. And for anyone who's keeping track at home, I've never won against Craig, so it's all on today. But,
Not all on today. You make it sound like you win this and all other competitions we've done are null and void.
We end the podcast if I don't win. No. Let's first get to our recap, talking about some of the films that we've discussed over the past few months. So, Craig, how do you feel about the run of films so far? When we decided to go through this kind of format of every episode leading to the next, what did you kind of expect? Does this stay to what you kind of expected? Have you had a better time than you thought, a worse time?
Have you heard of that theory of just there is a reason why we need bad things to happen in our lives so that we can appreciate the good? Yeah, that's been this run of films. I don't know. I feel like most choices have been way too safe insofar as these are just universally acclaimed films to the point of discussing them week on week. After a while, you still lose that sense of euphoria because you just start going, yeah, it was good.
It was amazing for a reason,
Yeah, it was just, there were just good things. And just after a while, I'm just like, you know what? I want something bad. I want something to just genuinely get angry about. Honestly, this has just felt like a weird form of medication, and it's not the kind of good medication. It's that sort of, sedative medication. Just after a while, I'm just here going, just trying to find something to just get absolutely sort of passionate about. And there's only so much that, positive passion can necessarily take you so far. So for anyone who happens to be listening and is going to be a guest, if you want to suggest some utterly garbage films, I'm ready. Come on, bring them on. I've had suggestions waiting, and then people have gone, yeah, I'm not going to go with this. I'm going to go with this. I think the closest we've obviously gotten is the last film that we discussed, which you can't even call it necessarily a bad film. It's just a film that sort of aged poorly, and also just conceptually is a bit odd. Yeah. But it's made in a very good way for the time. It's just that, I'm sorry, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is a stupid concept. So you can only do so much with it until you just go, yeah, all right, we've made this the best that we can. We just have to accept that it's just not going to be seen for all time. It's not something you can necessarily call bad. It's just we didn't put it in.
I think for me, on the flip side, I would say that I kind of went in expecting the bad, we get to choose what they need to watch and this make them suffer. And to go along with what Craig has said, I think I'm more on the side of I'm a bit more fascinated by some of the films which are they're almost great, or they're like a 2-star, 2.5. It should be good, but there's just so much missing from it. Or they have, like I said, problematic elements. Or they looked like they were going to be amazing in the trailers. Those kind of films I quite enjoy, similar to Eternals, which I'm a defender of this film. I like it because everything that I do think is strong about it is very strong, but I can also acknowledge that there's a lot wrong with it as well. But I don't think it should be kind of like the Twitter style of it's either terrible or really good, which kind of goes against what, obviously the dud or, well worth watching. But hey.
And you finally admit it. Every episode asking me, was this a dud or was this great? I'm just,
we're part of the machine. But, that's where the discussion element comes into it. But I think, I do enjoy that kind of discussion. And it is right that, sometimes when every film is amazing, it's hard to sort of pick them apart as much. But I did expect more people to be let's give them this to suffer from. And even though, like you said, give us some more challenging films, I've never been give us Birdemic and give us some crazy random language film, because those again are very they're just awful, they're terrible for a reason, or it's very hard to sit through or get any pleasure from. That's why it's again those where we've talked about before, things like Van Helsing, Mortal Kombat. There's like fan bases, there's people who love this, there's reasons to like them, there's reasons not to like them. I think those are sometimes the fun discussions. So, but because I thought that we would get a lot of bad recommendations, I have enjoyed having a lot of these great films to talk about, especially after, again, last year where we had the likes of Space Jam 2, Venom, Let There Be Carnage. There was so much stuff that I watched last year, which I was like, oh, this is so mediocre and terrible. I kind of now, and things like Netflix films, which I was like, oh, this looks good. And then I watched it, I was like, oh, that was kind of just, okay. So I have enjoyed having like a bit more quality recently and having some prestige films. But I think, like you said, rightfully transition into maybe some more interesting films in terms of quality, I think will be good. Paul, where do you come, not specifically about those films, but where do you come down on kind of like, great masterpieces and controversial films? I suppose you've already alluded to it a bit with Dark Knight and Eternals.
Yeah, my kind of thing, like just when judging a film, is sometimes there's I differentiate between a film that I love and a film that I think is great, because like I love Scooby-Doo the movie. It is not a good film, but I love it, and I will defend it with my life. I love Coyote Ugly. It's a bad film, but I love it. The Godfather is a great film. I don't know that I would watch it of an afternoon, just go, oh, I fancy watching Godfather Part 2. It's a heavy film. So there's a good, there are great films and there are bad films that are enjoyable. And I kind of have that thing of like, this film, like Eternals, like Wonder Woman 1984, I really do enjoy. It's problematic as sin. There's a lot of stuff in it where you're like, that's an issue, that's a problem. But I think when you get into like directors that are sort of the brand or franchises as a whole, there is that thing of it either has to be the greatest film ever made or it's the worst thing ever. And it's like, sometimes things are just average. Like, sometimes a Star Wars film is just okay. Like with something like Star Wars, it's like varying quality is what Star Wars made its name in. Like not all of Lucas's stuff was a home run. And the same with like, with Marvel, where it's like, oh, is this going to be the moment where the bubble bursts? It's like, Eternals is fine. It should have been a miniseries and Falcon should have been a movie, but it's fine. Black Widow is fine. It's enjoyable. People are like, it's dreadful. It's not dreadful. It's just okay. And that's okay. That's my sort of philosophy on it. Sometimes a Christopher Nolan film is just okay.
Yeah, I think some people try to get too caught up in maybe not so much Spielberg, maybe back in the day of like, home run after home run, but, Quentin Tarantino, who's very selective and got these like, small selection of films that he makes. But when you're going to get directors that like Patty Jenkins, etc., which come onto these big projects, as we mentioned before, people like Taika Waititi, there's going to have to be some sacrifices of like vision, or if they do go all in with their vision, then you come out with something quite jarring sometimes. So that's why, again, with something like a Tim Burton film or like with Wonder Woman 1984, sometimes I'll watch them and be like, yes, I could see why somebody wouldn't enjoy this or why it's a bit problematic. But I'm like, but I wouldn't want to lose those things that are so strong for what would make it a better film, because same with Multiverse of Madness. I'm like, well, if you then made it a more conventional audience-pleasing film, then you're going to lose everything that's kind of so original and unique about it. It's the same with something like the Avatar films. They're very much made for like mass appeal, like kind of give very generic story, big visuals, easy to understand story. So then, you can be like, yeah, it looks great, and it's a very easy to enjoy film, but it just means that it's just fun popcorn kind of stuff. Whereas then when you get your more so like risky projects in which people come away and be like, oh, I don't like how that character did this was a bit too violent for me, this turned this, and it's like, well, that's where it's going to come down to people who are like, this is my jam, this is not my jam, and I think that's why, again, this franchise stuff can be fine in that sense, that you can be even somebody who watches some of the DC films and could actually go, I'm more of a Wonder Woman 1984 type of Wonder Woman fan, or you could have more of a I'm Wonder Woman, the first film, kind of fan, because I think there's a bit of Snyder influence on that first film, whereas like Patty Jenkins said with 1984, she kind of wanted to bring in the more kind of Wonder Woman doesn't use weapons kind of element to the character. It depends how you view that character, and for a character who's existed for so long, there's going to be different interpretations of them. The same with Superman. Same with Star Wars. What does Star Wars mean to you? So many people come away from like Rogue One and say that is Star Wars to me, and it's just like it depends on what those films are for you. I've been yearning for a kind of more like Jedi, light and dark kind of film, like what we got in things like Phantom Menace, Revenge of the Sith. Haven't had that yet, but I have had it in things like Clone Wars and Visions, which then is more creative kind of like focused stories.
Yeah, and it's also that kind of thing. Like you kind of have to take stuff for what it is as well. I think the problem with something like Wonder Woman 84 is that I think people expected a modern superhero film, and what Jenkins did was she was like, well, it's set in the 80s. I've made an 80s superhero film, and if you look at like Superman 2 or Superman 3, they're really silly. They're like Superman 3's got like Richard Pryor doing slapstick comedy, and then you watch this and you're like, this is filled with slapstick. It's like clearly that's what she's gone. I want to make a film from the 80s. And it's the same with the Burton Batmans as well. They're very much like, they're not great Batman films, but they're very good weird Tim Burton films. But if you're a diehard comic obsessive, that's like, if Batman's like your hero, you're going to hate those films because he's just killing people left, right, and center. He's nuts. It's a weird Tim Burton goth movie, and Batman kind of secondary. And so it's kind of that thing of, same with like The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson was like, I'm going to subvert expectations. And a lot of people are like, we don't want expectations subverted. We want all the bits that we like played out again. But then I sort of think, may as well take a risk. You might as well swing for the fences. And if it doesn't land properly, then, then it doesn't. I mean, I still think a bit like, one of the films we have here, Sherlock Holmes. Doing a sort of geezer reboot of Sherlock Holmes seems like such a risky idea. And you're like, yeah, but you just go along with it because it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, because then it just gives you that, like, smorgasbord of different versions, isn't it? Like, if you don't want the same type of character, same type of film for these characters each time, it's like, oh, what if, this character was like this? What if it was set in this period, etc.? It's a fun way of doing it. And I think that's what'll be interesting in the future, especially when we're talking about the movie vault, is like, well, this is a great, Sam Raimi, Tim Burton film, but then does that mean that it should be remembered in that sense, even if people didn't enjoy it as much, or it's more of a problematic film? I think quite a lot of these films are, they're known for being just so like famous for their genre and for what they did in terms of like breaking the mold, etc., but not so much like this has got the fingerprints, apart from maybe Snatch, of like their director all over it. But they are very kind of like important for their kind of genres and those sections of the industry. Craig, was there any kind of like specific highlights from the run that you sort of look back on fondly?
I mean, I'm still in awe of A Town Called Panic, just because of just an absolute sheer contrast to everything that we were, looking at the time. We had a lot of films that, structurally made sense and were just made like that. And then you have this weird stop motion French piece of just, we don't care what the narrative is. We're just going to throw everything we have. We just don't care. It's just going to be manic and fun. And I'm still in love with that film. And it just broke things up for me in a way that just gave me a sort of childlike enthusiasm again.
Yeah, I was going to say the highlight for me as well is just even that animation era, even though Akira is, again, one of those films we were saying, which, of course it has to go in. It's this masterpiece of anime. But I did really enjoy sort of like revisiting that film because, I came kind of late to Akira. I kind of rewatched that during the pandemic when they were talking about the 4K re-release and everything like that. So again, to rewatch it again a short time after experiencing it for the first time last time, and because it's such a like heavy film in terms of like its themes and the kind of animation style, I was like, oh, I'm able to kind of appreciate a lot more of the nuances within this and kind of really respect why it's such a massive film. I think, like we said before, there's a lot of famous films that you get in the past which you kind of look at and kind of rewatch afterwards. Something like, say, Top Gun now, which is going to have Top Gun Maverick come out, in which you watch the original, you're like, yeah, I can see why that's famous. I see why everyone likes it. There's a lot of famous films like that, and you kind of come away kind of like, that hasn't like influenced me or changed me personally, but I can just see why it's good, or I can't find much fault with it, but it's not my jam, as we were saying before. Whereas Akira, again, it doesn't necessarily like go to all of my tastes, like, in that episode we were talking about, crazy sci-fi stuff and neo punk sort of stuff. But again, I just kind of like loved the boldness of it, and it kind of reminded me of what I love about anime and animation, about what kind of stories you can tell. So that entire kind of run of like A Town Called Panic, Akira, Your Name, I thought they were all great representations of what animation can provide, and all the different kinds of stories that you can have. So we'll go on now to, breaking down those kind of like films we've had. We'll just pick a few of the highlights, as we saw mentioned there, or if there's anything that we haven't mentioned. I'll tell you all the list up front, which is all the films we've discussed over the past few months. So we've got The Room from 2003, Sherlock Holmes from 2009, Snatch from 2000, The Italian Job from 1969, The Dark Knight from 2008, A Town Called Panic from 2009, Akira from 1998, and Your Name from 2016, and then Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde from 1971. So starting at the top there, Paul, I know, as you said, you got some thoughts on The Room. Do you think that was a good place for us to start off?
I think The Room is always the best place to start, because it's not good. It's poorly made. It's made shoddily. It's badly acted. It's terribly written. It's edited bad. Everything about it is awful. And yet, I've seen it several times. I read The Disaster Artist, the Greg Sestero book. I saw, the film of The Disaster Artist, and I don't believe Tommy Wiseau's thing where he's like, oh, it was always meant to be a comedy. It's like, no, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
It's the same thing as, Shyamalan says it about The Happening. He was like, no, it was always meant to be an over-the-top comedy. That's all. It's like, no, it wasn't. No. You have never indicated that you are a comic director. You make supernatural thriller horror movies, and that's what The Happening was meant to be. And The Room was meant to be a steering relationship drama that is one of the funniest films I've ever seen, and it's so quotable. And I think it's one of those things. People talk about cult movies, and here's that thing: if you try and make a cult movie, you'll just make a bad film. But if you try and make a good film, you'll make a cult movie in the process. And but that is like the ultimate one. The fact that Prince Charles Cinema in London shows it every month, and people show up in droves with spoons and dressed as the characters and shout the lines at it. And I mean, I do it all the time. Someone walks into a room, I do turn around and go, oh, hi, Mark. I think it is a terrible film that has brought a lot of joy to people, which in a way is better than just a drama that would have, if it was just an awards bait drama, it would have been forgotten. Nobody would remember it.
Yeah, and I think that it goes to show as well about if you deliberately go out there to make a bad film, or you try to make something really good and it fails, like I said earlier with something like Birdemic or something, in which it's just like you see these awful CGI effects, it's not quite as interesting then, in which you're like, oh, I can just recognize this is just really bad and this is a struggle to watch. Whereas there's just something about The Room which is fascinating. And I think definitely that experience factor is why I think it deserves to be in the movie vault, because when I first saw it, I had seen like reviews of it, like scenes from it, but when I first watched the entire thing, it was at university, and we had like this sort of film society night in which everyone was in this kind of lecture theatre and everyone was bursting out laughing and kind of like, what? Oh my God, what's going on? So it was such a great communal experience. And that's, like you said, Paul, is why those, cinema trips, make so much sense, because it's such a fun experience for people to have together. And I think that it's also led to this kind of fun acknowledgement almost of like cult films which are like bad and you enjoy for that reason, as you were sort of mentioning before. Maybe not to the levels of like Scooby-Doo, which has still got like some enjoyable elements to it, but there's definitely those films which are just like goddamn awful, which people get like a kick out of because they're so badly made. The fact that we've then had films like, maybe Ed Wood was like the original kind of one, but then we've also had The Disaster Artist, Dolomite Is My Name. Like, I love both of those films because they're kind of made with such enthusiasm and kind of show a different side of the industry, of not being just like, here's this really famous director and here's why they're really good. You look at like a film from years ago, I think that Anthony Hopkins Hitchcock film, in which you were like, yeah, it's kind of what you expect it to be. It wasn't, we know who Hitchcock is. Whereas, I didn't know who Dolomite was. And, to have the same thing with Disaster Artist of this, like, Tommy Wiseau, which is such a strange character. So to kind of be presented with him on screen with a character that you're not used to seeing in film is kind of unique. And the same with Dolomite Is My Name, is to kind of see this passion coming from somebody and things that people are like cracking up laughing, and seeing how somebody approaches, they're like, let's just run with it, let's kind of do it. It's fun to watch. And I think, I would be happy to see more films like that, like focusing on these like bad filmmakers. Who knows, maybe one day in the future we'll get like a how the Fantastic film was made or something like that, but probably you would see just how they all had a terrible time. But
yeah, that would literally just be a film of loads of people going, we want to do this, and then just Fox executives coming in just like, hey guys,
just Josh Trank there like, please don't, so. But I don't know, maybe there's a better example of like terrible films being made. But yeah, I enjoy that kind of like weird subgenre that has been created. Similar with the Nick Cage film, I guess, as well, of kind of acknowledging the kind of campiness and
to an extent, but that's done in a sort of massively different way, right? It was more sort of Nick being frustrated with his position in life and having to come to terms with it to some extent, as opposed to like this actual look.
Unbearable Weight did feature one of my favorite jokes, which is when they're talking about how he meets like his wife, and he was like, oh yeah, she was a costume designer, or she was a makeup artist on Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I love that film. Oh, it's underrated for sure. Like, that is still, it's a bad film, but that is a good joke.
Yeah.
But The Room, interestingly, led us then to Sherlock Holmes, which was your pick, Craig, from that Endgame.
Yeah.
Did you get out of that choice what you wanted? Because that was one you'd never seen.
As in, I wanted to see the film, so I saw it. Yes, it gave me exactly what I wanted.
But in terms of what you were expecting from the quality, I guess.
I don't think I was really expecting anything. I think, look, I knew to some extent that it was going to be somewhat competent insofar as enough people liked it, so they made a sequel I've not yet seen, and potentially a third sequel to which I've heard absolutely nothing about anymore. I'm genuinely confused as to what's happening to this film.
Recently, there's been rumors that Johnny Depp might be in the next one. That Robert Downey Jr. wants Johnny Depp to be in it, but it's like, okay, it's coming back alive. But
okay,
it's been directed by Dexter Fletcher. I read that Dexter Fletcher's doing it because Guy Ritchie was like, but I've got like 20 other movies I need to make. So Dexter Fletcher's a good choice. He's a good director. So, and he's been in a lot of Guy Ritchie stuff. So he's gonna. But I've not heard any, apart from the fact that, yeah, Johnny and Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law have gone like, yeah, we'll do it when it's, when they say show up on this time at this point, we'll be there. It just seems weird that like the second one came out in like 2011 or something, and it's been over 10 years. It just seems a bit weird. You would have thought strike while the iron's hot, especially when Robert Downey Jr. was like a hot property. He's kind of fizzled a bit. Doolittle was meant to be his big I'm not just Iron Man thing, and that kind of was awful. So I don't know.
Doolittle, again, is something I still find a lot of offence in, both insofar as being a Welshman listening to that accent, to insofar as I was sent to watch it on my own, wasn't I, David?
Yeah, it is weird that one has been so long since for the sequel. The only hope, like the reason I kind of most want it to be made is because it would give hope to a Hellboy 3. It's like if we're going to have like long awaited like sequels, then maybe there's hope for Hellboy 3 if that one does come out. Maybe not the same sort of like financial success the studios would see it as maybe for the Sherlock films compared to those Hellboy films, but we can always live in hope of like long awaited sequels after many years. But it also is interesting how that Sherlock Holmes led us down this kind of route of, we even circled back to it almost with Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, of these kind of like gritty crime related films.
Oh, this is going to be a stretch, you connecting those two films.
Well, no, but I mean in terms of like, you know, we had Snatch, we had Italian Job, we had Dark Knight. And then so somewhat then Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde was still circling back to that kind of like era and everything like that as well. And now...
No, it wasn't.
Well, we're going to Frenzy next as well. So we are still back on that, you know, that road of like, you know, crime thrillers, these kind of directors.
Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is not a crime thriller.
No, but I said the period for that one. That's the period it was set in, like
what, the 1800s?
It's period.
To be fair, Sherlock Holmes has more in common with The Dark Knight in that Sherlock Holmes feels like a very Batman Begins react. You know that era where everyone went, "Hey, Batman Begins was good. Can we do a dark, gritty reboot?" You know,
with weird gadgets, yeah.
And Sherlock Holmes felt like Sherlock Holmes Begins sort of thing. So and then it kind of ties into The Dark Knight and things like that.
Yeah, that I will give you. I agree with that interpretation, right? If the conversation was we had a sort of like linear sort of crime gritty-esque going from Sherlock Holmes and ending at Dark Knight, I would have not ranted.
But what I mean is, like, we're not talking about next time, like some weird sci-fi film, or like we're like in talking about like fantasy or anything. We're still back to those kind of like crime films. I just find it interesting.
And again, if any future guests are listening, can you break the genre a little bit?
Craig wanted to get off the Guy Ritchie train, okay? But
well, yeah, insofar as people were just going, oh, we've had one Guy Ritchie film, let's go into another. It's like, yeah, can we not have that for every week? Because otherwise it's literally just hello and welcome to Guy Ritchie movies.
But yeah, Paul, you said you had some thoughts on Sherlock Holmes as well. What do you think of that as a kind of like, it's an interesting entry. That's probably the one which I disagreed with most of going into the movie vault, actually. But yeah, I think it was definitely fun in the sense of like setting this trajectory of having some more random films thrown in there.
I really liked it. I didn't expect to. I thought I enjoy it. That first one, you can kind of feel like it does suffer from setting up like their version of Sherlock Holmes. So it's like we have to introduce, you know, our version of Victorian London. We have to so the villain, as good as Mark Strong is as Blackwood, you do feel like you're not as strong a villain as, you know, that you get like in the second one with Moriarty, where you're like, oh, this is a confident. Again, a bit like Batman Begins, where you're like, the villain's a bit weak, and then you go to the Dark Knight and you're like, oh, it's the Joker. Okay, it's his arch nemesis. So it's kind of they've got a similar issue, the Batman Beginsy thing, of you do a lot of heavy lifting to introduce your characters. But I think it's an interesting route to go. I know that I thought the action sequences were really well done.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I thought that, you know, you still had the fun, you know, aspect of him analyzing the situation, you know, with the boxing, etc. And even just when like he jumps out of his house or whatever, and he like, you know, he puts all the soot on his face and stuff like that. There's like a lot of like inventive sequences like that, and a lot of fun and, you know, good dynamic between him and Jude Law, which obviously is what people wanted to see more.
The banter was what worked best when it was sort of like a Shane Black movie, you know, and it was kind of that buddy film, and they're bickering and arguing, and there's all that talking sort of over each other and at the same time and stuff. I thought that was when the film worked best, and the sort of actual plot was kind of like, I don't really actually care about this mystery. I just want to see Watson and Holmes argue over something while beating up bad guys.
Which does sound counterintuitive for a Sherlock Holmes plot when you think about it, but does weirdly work to some extent.
I like the fact that, their version of Watson wasn't just like guy who falls over and gets bonked on the head. He was actually a military man. He's now a doctor, that kind of thing. But it is weird that, all the stuff about, we have to uncover the secret cult and the order of... I was just a bit like, I don't really care about this. I will put him back in the dockyard beating up the big goon and talking about opium again. That's where the film is at its strongest. And the plot is kind of not important, really, which, does feel weird to say about, detective fiction.
Well, that one also led us then to the film which we discussed with you, Paul, and Reese, which was fun as well, because that was a big favourite of his was Snatch from 2000. Again, I think another sort of deserving entry to the vault, because we just said it was one of those films in which we have to put it in because of its legacy. It's, really skyrocketed Ritchie's career, etc. And, the lines and everything I come away from, really respecting that aspect. I think you said, Reggie, Paul, that you were surprised how well it's aged considering some of the the jokes and the content that is in there. I guess that one obviously we've already discussed, and when we said about highlights, it wasn't particularly in the highlights because I guess it was one of those of we have to acknowledge about how famous and how well done this film was done. Maybe not so much for Craig, didn't enjoy it as much, but
I was just skeptical about how I should view certain things, that's all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still not going to be a film that I probably will ever revisit unless prompted, but I couldn't really argue with you guys about any of the things you were necessarily saying.
Yeah.
Nor could I be bothered to.
One of those of it wasn't my jam kind of thing, as we were saying before. I was really happy with what we got then after that, as we mentioned earlier, The Italian Job from 1969, because for me, I kind of, this film has always kind of been there, whether I've always watched it fully through, but I know watching it with my dad, etc. And what I really loved about rewatching this again was every time I've watched it, I've kind of been like, oh, this is really good. This is really enjoyable. You can see why it's so good. And rewatching it this time, I was like, you know what? This would go into one of my top lists or something. I think this, not sure about top 10 or something, but this is really a favorite. I think that's what really stuck with me after watching it, is that film was still in my head for quite a while afterwards. Just all the scenes is so iconic, the funeral parts when they're racing through the city, etc. The characters, etc. I think it's just really iconic, and I really love talking about that film and revisiting it again. I think that in some ways it is kind of not talked about enough, I think, The Italian Job. And I think it's kind of surprising that so many people go, oh, the Mark Wahlberg one? I'm like, what? What are you on about? I'm surprised that the legacy sometimes is that people only talk about the new one. So yeah, I really enjoyed talking about The Italian Job. And I was glad I did. So it definitely, I think, is very deserving entry into the movie vault, and one that, has such iconic scenes and lines such as, you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. But again, I think even that is testament to, it's not just about that line. I think there's so many other good lines in that film and so many other sequences that I love.
I'm still obsessed with the production history of that film. It is the most fun I've ever had writing a VHS corner. So, Paul, I'm not sure if you heard, but my favorite fact about the film was that in order to get gridlock scenes, in order to basically show how they've sort of, halted the city so they could just drive through and heist, they did ask city officials if they could shut down the traffic lights, and the city officials said no. So in the end, the actual mafia shut off roads for them. And they actually, they paid the mafia. So basically, anytime I have to argue about, mafia solving for where the state fails, I'm using that as an example.
I didn't know that. I knew. I mean, my introduction to The Italian Job was the PS1 game.
Same, yes, same.
Yeah, I guess
you remember that back in the day. There was a PlayStation. Then I saw the film one afternoon on TV, and the theme tune, the lines. And I do remember Michael Caine in 170 different interviews going, "Oh, there was going to be a sequel," and that the plan was that we let the bus go over the edge, and then they have to re-steal the gold from like the mafia or something, like the Italian government or something like that. It was like, so it was another car heist, and I was like, why didn't they make that?
Yeah, there were multiple competing theories about what the actual plot would have been. So yeah, that was one of them. Another one I think was just that the bus stayed still and then just got towed by the mafia. There's so many ideas of what they would have happened.
That thing you were saying about why isn't it as well remembered is that it sits in that period where like every film Michael Caine did was a certifiable classic. So like, so it's like the same era as Alfie, as Zulu, as Get Carter, as Man Who Would Be King. So you kind of have that thing of like there's just like a hit after a hit after a hit. And yeah, so because I always, when I look back, I'm like, oh yeah, Michael Caine made some good films. I look back, I'm like, oh, and he did that one as well. It's not like when you get to the 80s and the 90s where it's like there's a good film and then there's like 5 really bad films and then there's a good film again. It was like just every film he made was like a classic.
Yeah, speaking of Michael Caine, I needed to bring this up because I've forgotten about it. I was in the doctor's surgery last week because, looking after myself. And I saw an advert that they had from NHS Wales about getting the booster. For some reason, Michael Caine is the actor they have.
Wow.
So it starts off as Elton John. They're basically doing a sort of audition they wanted the celebrity to look as if they've just had the vaccine and basically look as okay. And they end up not using Elton John because he's too animated and just too unrealistic. And he's like, right, fine, throw it away. I'm the biggest celebrity you'll get. Cut. And then Michael Caine, they've just had it. It's like, thank you, my dear. Oh, hello, I'm Michael Caine. It's like, why is Michael Caine doing adverts for the NHS?
Couldn't have gotten like a Welsh person to do it? Tom Jones?
Oh, no, I don't think it was. I might have accidentally said NHS Wales when I meant NHS, but like, yeah, just for some reason they got both Elton John and then just a short Michael Caine.
Oh, don't worry. Just get the jab. It's all right, guys. Don't worry.
Yeah, I think when I was like editing that, I was getting a lot of Michael Caine suggested videos on YouTube and etc. where I was like searching the trailer and things like that. And I think there's that interview from like Parkinson where he said like, is it where he does his own sort of like impression where he talks about the birthday cards, like when people open birthday cards, he's like, hello, this is Michael Caine and all this, and he's like, when he hears that, he's just like, where does this come from? But the bit that absolutely cracked me up when I was also editing the Italian Job episode was our guest Luke talks about the PS1 game as well, and he said that, you know, what made him laugh about it was that the person who's like playing Michael Caine's character, you know, clearly is not Michael Caine, and it sounds like they've just got like any voice actor or anybody down the road or something to like voice them and just do a typical Michael Caine impression. So I was kind of like, I need to like find this now. So I just typed in YouTube, you know, PS1 Italian Job gameplay, and it had me in stitches just listening to the like just this person voicing over as it's going through like this really basic 2D map of London, just like, right, and what you need to do then is go around the turn, and we need to do this, and it's just so funny if you want to listen to bad Michael Caine impressions and very PS1 level kind of like gameplay. It's great. Yeah, that led us then, interestingly, another kind of like sharp turn, I suppose, as we were talking about, you know, as we'll get on to with Town Called Panic. But yeah, we went then to The Dark Knight, mainly with the Michael Caine link there. And it was kind of timely as well, because that's when The Batman had just come out as well. So, Paul, you've already mentioned that you know, your kind of thoughts on it, maybe a bit controversial in terms of Batman Begins. I'm kind of glad you said that as well, because it was such an episode in which we were kind of like, oh, it's this kind of like famous, this big comic book movie that everyone needs to love. And, you know, I've always kind of like, I watched it first and was like, yeah, that's amazing. Second watch, I was like, I'm not sure if I do love it just as much. And I think that is what, you know, the struggle I have with it is not seeing it as a Batman film, but a Joker film or a Christopher Nolan film. And I think that that's why it was kind of timely with the release of The Batman, was because, again, that was such a kind of drastic take on the character.
Yeah, and I think as well with it, it's that kind of thing of, like, Marvel always say, "Oh, it's a superhero film, but it's a different genre as well. It's a heist movie." And Nolan described his trilogy as Batman Begins is like a psychological thriller, and then The Dark Knight is a crime action thriller, like a Michael Mann Heat kind of film, and then Rises is a kind of historical epic. He wanted that kind of A Tale of Two Cities, the story of a nation kind of thing. And I think that's probably where people divert is, well, which would you prefer? Do you prefer the Michael Mann? Do you prefer the historical? Do you prefer the psychological? And maybe I like The Dark Knight Rises to an extent, but it is that kind of thing of Batman Begins felt a bit more fantasy than The Dark Knight. But when I rewatched The Dark Knight, because actually, funny enough, I was rewatching it the other day, and the opening, I think it's about half an hour. I'm surprised how quickly it moves at a pace. It's like, right, you're introduced to the Joker. Right, he's done this. You know who the Joker is. Cool. Right, this is where the crime is at after the first film. This is what Batman's been doing. This is Harvey Dent. See him in court. That's what he's like. That's the mayor. That's good. Like, it just cuts through all of them. And it kind of, the scenes end before they finished a sentence. It's just kind of really booking through the first half an hour of setting every character up so that you can then sort of slow it down a bit. And it is quite interesting that the middle of the film is it's almost like one long set piece. And I still enjoy it. I remember seeing it in IMAX, and the bit where the truck flips still blows my mind. And the fact that, only Christopher Nolan can go, we're going to flip a real truck though. We're going to do that for real. If you're jumping off a building, you're going to jump off a real building. If we're going to have two ships, it's going to be two ships. Only he can sort of get away with saying, no, everything has to be real. We have to destroy real buildings. We have to destroy real cars.
Yeah, I think that's what was the surprise for me revisiting it. Like, when I it had been a few years since I watched it, and when I think back of it, it's like, oh, this is dark, gritty Batman. There's these conversations about Joker. And then when I was rewatching, I was like, wow, I forgot how Mad Max-esque it is, in the sense that it's just this constant kind of action set piece almost. They're just like one to the other. Like the bit you were talking about where you were saying about how things like almost end before, quite quickly. The one that sticks out in my mind is when like the Joker breaks up that party and he shoves, Rachel off like the roof. And then like when Batman goes to save her and everything, and then when it goes to like the next scene or something, I was like, wait, what happened to Joker? What happened with the party? I remember sort of thinking, have I missed something here? But yeah, I think that to me was why the takeaway was like, oh, its strength is what it is as this kind of like massive thriller set piece. The hospital one is one that always gets me. I think that's the one that maybe blows my mind the most, is when you see him walking away from that.
It is his film, and it's, I know that a lot of those kind of movies, the villains win out. And actually, I think maybe the thing I like about Batman Begins is it's one of the first superhero films where the villains didn't upstage the hero. But then you get to Dark Knight, and it's Heath Ledger's film, and even the tragedy of his untimely death looms over the film as well. But even if he hadn't passed away, I still think that would have been a performance for the ages, because there's no Heath Ledger in it. I can't see the guy from Brokeback Mountain or 10 Things I Hate About You. Like, I try and see, every time I watch it, I'm like, I just can't see that guy. He doesn't exist. He's gone. It's one of those performances where, and a lot of people said at the time, oh, he won the Oscar because he died. And to be honest with you, I think he would have won anyway. I think the Academy did genuinely want to give The Dark Knight something, like not just a technical award, but they wanted to give it a, quote unquote legitimate award, one of the big ones.
What I will say is you can definitely see where the Batman has tried to take a handful of potential elements. There are elements where, especially with the way in which the Riddler presented himself, and I've made jokes about this before with regards to, appearing on the sort of the camera and the TV screens, etc. He definitely tries to replicate to some extent the horror of like the Heath Ledger sort of video death scene, but probably takes it a bit too far, insofar as I made so many jokes about the eyes wide open, just going in diagonally on the screen. Insofar as I see Dark Knight as a Joker film and I see the Batman as a Batman film, that's why I think it's quite easy for me to just enjoy them both completely separately, right? The Batman is just actually a detective film, which is something very few Batman films have actually been.
Yeah.
Whereas The Dark Knight, as much as they want to claim it's the sort of crime thriller, I think does go a little bit more into sort of like social theory and try to execute those ways in ways that the other two films in the genre.
It's a bit more cops and robbers.
Yeah.
It's a bit more, I do the crime and then you chase me down the street kind of thing, as opposed to, the whole, I've got to uncover this clue leads to that clue. And they are very different takes on the character. And I think both work depending on what you want. If you want a crime movie, or if you want, like a horror film with sequences that, I watch lots of weird, horrible, scary films. And even I was going, God, this is for a film aimed essentially at children. I know it was 15 in the UK, but, the toys are aimed at children. I was a bit like, I don't know how they're going to feel about a man having a carpet tucker cleaved into his skull, because I was like, oh God, this is horrible stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, my favorite brutal scene is just the with the henchmen. Is like, okay, we've only got space for one of you who are holding tryouts, and just leave them to it. And they're like, even it's so underrated as a scene, but I just love that facet of just forcing people to just become animalistic.
Well, I said earlier we were talking about animation. We've mentioned A Town Called Panic as one of the highlights. I also mentioned Akira, so I kind of guess it makes sense to kind of bunch these together in terms of like when we had that big run of animation. We had A Town Called Panic, we had Akira, and we had Your Name. Was there any standouts in terms of like what you've seen in the past, Paul, in terms of these animated films? Or any ones you've sort of checked out in the past, or any ones you love or hate any more than the other?
I've got a fondness for A Town Called Panic just because I remember getting a phone call. My dad lives in Sweden. I remember getting a phone call from him, and he was like, I've just seen this film. It's the maddest film I've ever seen. It's called A Town Called Panic. Watch it. And I was like, all right. And then I was watching it going, isn't this just the Cravendale adverts?
Yeah.
But for like an hour and a bit. And it was just bizarre that some people just were like, let's just get these little figurines of a Native American and a cowboy and a horse and just go do this madness. And yeah, like you were saying at the beginning about sort of narrative structure, it does feel like their response would be narrative. Who's that? Because it is just bonkers, as opposed to something. It feels so sort of singular that, like, in comparison, Akira, when you revisit that, I can't watch Akira without sort of going, oh wow, people really ripped you off, didn't they? They really stole from not just the Wachowskis, but sort of every kind of science fiction-y, futuristic kind of thing afterwards. They really ripped that movie off to the point where, a bit like when Ghost in the Shell got remade in live action and people are like, oh, we've seen this film. It's like, well, what it's based on got ripped to shreds and repurposed. So that's why I think like a live action remake of Akira, you would just sit there going, I've seen this film. This is The Matrix meets kind of Mad Max meets kind of Dark Knight meets, any Zack Snyder movie meets, any other big budget Hollywood movie from someone who saw that film. So that is kind of one of those ones where you're like, the influence is so big, but it is still enjoyable. I do still enjoy it.
It definitely is the one film, I think, of the batch that we've discussed that definitely has a lot of tropes named after it. So a lot of those aspects that we just sort of discussed, which I agree, a lot of films draw their inspiration directly from what Akira tries to do. I just also know that whenever now in anime there's like a motorbike being ridden and it slides specifically on the side, it's always called the Akira slide. And there are just so many tropes like that because of things that Akira does that become so iconic. So yeah, it was just an impossible one to ever sort of keep away from us, I guess, to ever say, to basically put in the movie vault. It just had to go in, even if other things that have ripped it off have improved some elements in some areas, right? I don't think it's a perfect film, but obviously just taking it all in at once, there is a majesty to the film, which means you have to, appreciate it.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, I guess, because there would be films out there which I'm like, I like it, do I love it? And would I give this a perfect rating? And with something like Akira, I find it hard not to like give it a sort of 5-star, even though I can see that there are problems there or there are elements that maybe don't work for some people or would make it better. But I'm just like, everything that you do well, you do so well. I think it just like covers up like any sort of problems. And just because they're so dedicated to this one route, I'm like, it's like I said earlier, if you sort of did it a different way, then it would become a completely different film. And I think what stood out for me, especially with all three of these animated films, the second two more so, but I suppose it comes into the kind of style aspect that they're all very visually very, very different. A Town Called Panic, like you said, there is a charm there. We were talking in the episode about that kind of like, nostalgia and kind of connection you have to stop motion and specifically even like farm toys and animals. Why do we kind of like cling to this kind of stuff? Wallace and Gromit, Chicken Run, they all have that kind of same aesthetic and vibe, that kind of like warmness to it, the chaotic element to it. And even though, like you said, Paul, that they're just these little figurines, they've got barely any detail on there, but you're not watching it going like, oh, there's no detail there. And people have talked about it quite a lot recently in terms of like CGI and all of that kind of stuff. And I've said, if I can watch like some janky CGI from, the early 90s, it doesn't bother me when it's like that bad. Okay, something like Cats, in which is just disturbing and weird, but when it's just it's not done in the best way, or it could it's maybe not the perfect representation of something, I'm like, I can get past that as long as the story is good enough, or as long as there's that style there. And I think that that's definitely the case with A Town Called Panic. Akira, complete opposite, so detailed, so much put into it, a real passion project. And like Craig said, I'm glad that we talked about it, because ultimately then when we're talking about influences of things like Matrix and all of these science fiction films, we've already talked about what has kind of inspired it, because it's so inspirational. And also like its music, I think, that the music from that is so iconic and is so unique and different. And that was a big part of Your Name, which is completely different type of music. But it goes to show what a big thing music is. I think all the other films we talked about, I wouldn't say that like, and maybe apart from The Dark Knight, the soundtrack is a big part of the film.
Oh, but what about The Room? The Room soundtrack is iconic.
For different reasons.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, I think that these animated films as well show the power of like combining all of those visual and audio elements together, especially with Your Name, which has such strikingly beautiful imagery, which, unlike Akira, which goes for the very grotesque, kind of like gritty, dark visuals, Your Name goes for those very like bright works of art kind of like visuals.
It's also that kind of thing where you have, the whole thing about animation. I know that there was a lot of upset at the Oscars where they made jokes about animation being for kids.
Sorry. Carry on, Paul. Sorry, I'll explain later.
Okay. But it is that kind of thing of, and I remember watching something about The Incredibles and Brad Bird going on some massive rant about how animation isn't a genre. It's just a way of presenting a story, because genre has tropes, but animation has no tropes. Like if you go describe an animated film, there's no set narrative. You can tell a science fiction cyberpunk thing. You can tell, a coming of age story. You can tell historical stories. The Wind Rises is, the Studio Ghibli film is a historical film. You could tell a war movie. Grave of the Fireflies is a prime example. You could tell, silly films and scary, you could do horror with animation. So it's one of those things. And sort of the three films that you guys have discussed kind of show that actually you can make an absurdist comedy that's almost like a Monty Python sketch, in that it's just like, and then suddenly this happens and then they go over here. Or you can tell a really gritty action thriller, or you could tell this really intimate character study. And the only difference is it's done with stop motion, or it's done with computers, or it's done with hand-drawn animation. That's the only difference, really. It's not, it's not just for children.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't think of A Town Called Panic like that, actually, but it is kind of like those scenes in between the scenes in Holy Grail of like, when the person's there doing the scroll and then like the sun and everything is jumping up and down. It's, quite like those Monty Python cartoons in that sense.
Yeah, so the reason that we started laughing at that is because literally in those episodes where we discussed it, every single guest brought up how Oscars disrespected animation. To the point, I think David and I had to have a chat about, like, look, have you kept this in? Because we've already discussed it at length.
Every episode was just like, how important is animation? Why is anime so great? It's like, well, a reason why it is important.
And literally, before you mentioned it, I was like, should I just mention now, because we're talking about free animation films, don't mention the Oscars? And then you mentioned it. I was like, there it is.
But that's why I love it, because it shows how much is pissed off people and how deep that kind of runs. And it goes to show that
we should just release an episode which is a compilation of all of our guests are talking about how much they don't like the Oscars because of their disrespect. Specifically Amy Schumer. If you're listening, I know you won't be, but if you ever listen to this podcast, Amy Schumer, f*** you, Amy Schumer.
Yeah, also, just because, she was making fun of animated films, and it was like, last year had some of the best, most sort of, for the whole family, everyone, Mitchell's versus Machines works when you're 7 and it works when you're 97. Encanto and Luca and all the, there was so many animated films that just worked for adults. I'm almost 30 and I'm sat there watching, stuff going, oh, I can relate to that. I remember what it was like sort of being in the shadow of this or that. And yeah, that thing is ridiculous because, yeah, also, there's stuff that you watch even in like Pixar films where you're like, that is not for children. That is very much for, the opening of Up is a prime example of that, where you're like, no kid is going to get this.
Yeah, all of those films then, were a build up to our final film. We talked about Your Name, and then that led us to Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde because of our guest Sarah's sort of love of the Dr. Jekyll and Hyde story, and this being a different take, and it was fun again to go back to Hammer Horror. But out of all of those films, unfortunately, the only film that didn't make it into the movie vault. So every other film's made it into the movie vault so far, but that one didn't, and I'm kind of glad of that because it gave us a film that was interesting to talk about. Why is it got its problems, but why is it also got some, good pros to it as well? I'm glad I watched it. I think it was a fun watch.
It was a film that we vehemently argued over.
But yeah, for me, just one that, like we were saying earlier, they are okay films. It doesn't have to be everything is either like amazing or terrible. Are we going to go watch Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde anytime soon again? Possibly not, but I'm glad that I did see it again to kind of like add to that horror era, to kind of understand it a bit more. And there's quite a lot of like interesting sort of facts and trivia from that one as well.
Yeah, I kind of, with Hammer, it's always the kind of thing with those films where you're like, did you ever actually read any of these books? Or is it just a vague assumption based on a title that you've kind of gone, yeah, that's probably what happens in that book, I guess. But I enjoy Hammer films because I enjoy watching the things where you're like, if any of them lean too hard on one of the walls, the whole set would fall down. And that one feels like one where you're like, if the camera moves slightly to the left or right, you would see that this is not, a Victorian era building. It's a soundstage with like cardboard set maids.
Yeah, it's very of that time of Hollywood of just like appreciating the kind of like, it's like when they always go to that like street set in American films, which I'm like, oh, it's that same like American street which they always use. Like it looks like the one in Friends and stuff like that, where it's like the kind of typical lampposts and cars and stuff like that. There's something kind of like nostalgic and kind of comforting about it. It's something like almost like when you're watching like a play or something, you're like, I know it's not real. I know it's not actually a physical place, but it kind of adds to the theatrics of it. And like you said, that if they leant on it, it would probably fall over, but it gives it somewhat of a charm, I think. But yeah, as a film as a whole, not one that would be like, it needs to go in the vault to be remembered for all time. And as I mentioned, I think almost at the admission maybe of Sarah, I don't want to speak for her, but she did, say the one film that she would put into the vault was like the early sort of like Jekyll and Hyde adaptation that came in like the 20s or 30s. So, the plenty interpretations of that story, and also that episode put the Jekyll and Hyde song from Arthur stuck in my head for weeks ever since.
I'm not the one who looked it up by choice afterwards. I mentioned its existence. You then went and did the further research.
Kind of had to. But yeah, that rounds up our sort of recap of all of the films that we've discussed recently. So for those keeping track at home, Into the Movie Vault so far this year has been The Room, Sherlock Holmes, Snatch, The Italian Job, The Dark Knight, A Town Called Panic, Akira, and Your Name. So those are all in the movie vault, all with different reasons for why they've been remembered. A lot of ones we've sort of like covered there. And yeah, we look forward to discussing some more films in the future, discussing, whether they should go into our movie vault, seeing what comes along on our little train of movies, of how one connects to the other. We look forward to how we get there, and we've got plenty of fun sort of diversions we'll make along the way. Obviously, we're going to have things like Halloween, in which we're going to discuss sort of like horror stuff. I'm sure in the summer there'll be some kind of like more blockbustery kind of stuff. Christmas at the end of the year. So yeah, it's going to be fun to see all the different directions that we take. But now, as I mentioned earlier, we do have still an Endgame, which gives us a little challenge for myself and Craig. So Paul has prepared a little quiz for us to test our knowledge on the films we've been discussing. How much have we been paying attention for the last few months of everything we have been watching? So Paul, if you're ready, it's over to you.
We're in the endgame now.
So there's 9 questions, so there will be a definitive winner, hopefully. Okay, question number 1. In Akira, what letter is on Takashi's Letterman jacket?
Ooh.
Craig.
Mm-hmm.
M?
It's a B.
Okay.
In The Room, Mike describes the discovery of his underwear as a what?
Oh. David? Unexpected surprise.
He says it's a tragedy.
All I could think of was the me underwears. I was just like,
You pause that. Me underwears. He goes, I had a little tragedy.
I just kept thinking of the chocolate stuff.
What does the Joker's calling card say when he hangs a fake Batman in public?
What does it say?
Craig?
Yeah.
For Dent?
Will the real Batman please stand up?
Oh, God.
In A Town Called Panic, how many of the 3 main characters have bases on their feet?
Craig. 2.
Yes.
Damn it.
Yeah, because I know that Cheval obviously wouldn't because the 4 legs.
I would have said that. Damn it. Speed.
In Snatch, Doug the Head is said to be about as Jewish as he is a what?
Did you say is as Jewish as he is a something? Is it?
Yeah.
David. Catholic nun.
Monkey.
Oh, okay. I was nowhere near then. So I was gonna say Yank. But like,
In Your Name, Taki's tie is 2 different shades of what? Like what color?
David. Green.
Yes. Ooh.
I can remember the
1-0.
poster.
In The Italian Job, which color Mini Cooper does Michael Caine use? Red, white, or blue?
Craig. Blue.
Red.
I would have said red.
In Sherlock Holmes, whenever Lord Blackwood appears, he is often accompanied by which animal?
David. A crow?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Final question. This
Okay.
might be the first time you win.
Good.
On the Gotham City Police Board of possible Batman suspects, the pictures are Bigfoot, Elvis Presley, and who?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, on the Gotham City Police Board of possible Batman suspects, the pictures are of Bigfoot, Elvis, and who?
David. Superman?
Lincoln.
Random.
But still, with two right, you are the winner.
Yay! not the most respectable of scores, but yeah. Still, people have won on less, I think. Yeah, they have. I think Luke got like one right. Hey. Awesome. Right, well, I have that at least under my belt. I have won an Endgame against Craig, and also I can probably go into ones in which I'm against the guests a bit more respectfully now after losing the past few. So yeah, thank you, Paul. Some great trivia questions there. Definitely challenged us. And thank you for joining us for this episode talking all about the last slew of films that we've had. For everyone at home, as we mentioned in our last episode, we've had a little bit of a break to give you this update, this little bonus episode. But next time we'll be talking about Frenzy, the Alfred Hitchcock film from 1972, which is kind of tied into the kind of horrific kind of acts that take place in Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, and also have some dodgy kind of gender representations as mentioned by Mary in that one, so that should be interesting to go through. So yeah, we'll be talking about that in the next episode. If you want to join the conversation, then go check out Frenzy in the meantime, so you can chat all about it with us and sort of see how it compares to your thoughts. But yeah, Paul, thank you again for joining us. Can you tell the people?
Thank you for having me back.
No problem. We'll definitely have you back for an actual film choice again as well. That'll be a fun one.
Probably not as an Endgame host again. We'll see.
yeah, we will. So
put me in the Endgame so that I can show just how little I remember about things when I have not vigorously watched them and looked things up so that I can think of questions.
So where can the people find you? What are your socials? And any specific projects or anything you've been up to which people should know about?
You can follow me on Twitter, Paul Klien Yo with 2 O's. That's where I post most of my work, sort of interviews with interesting people. I recently spoke to Leah Thompson from Back to the Future and cult icon Udo Kier. So those will be sort of floating around, and reviews and my terrible opinions on things. And if you want to see some really bad opinions and some bad puns, my letterboxd is Paul Klien Yo with 1 O, because I'm inconsistent.
Fair. Yeah, it's always fun when you get those like differences with people's letterbox, etc. Thank you again, Paul, for joining us. Go check out your letterbox. And we look forward to having everyone join us back when we're back on our train of films, talking about Frenzy. And seeing what goes into the movie vault. Anything lastly from yourself, Craig?
You know, at the beginning of the episode, I said this is the multiverse where I could tolerate you the most. Yeah, I think that's changed now.
This episode has tested that. This is the multiverse in which I've won an Endgame. Right, well, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.
To keep up with the latest episodes of Well Good Movies, you can listen to us on all your usual podcast outlets, including Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and more. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe, and rate us where you can to keep our podcast growing. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Well Good Movies to keep up with the latest news and highlights from all our episodes, as well as tell us what movies you want to be discussed in the future. And if all of that isn't enough, you can also find us at our website, freshtakehub.com/wellgoodmovies, where you can catch all our episodes along with videos and articles deep diving into the worlds of film and television. So what are you waiting for? Go check out the film we'll be discussing in next time's episode.